All right, we're back with some more 40K Tactics stuff. We've had a lot of questions in the store after Nova Open, and we just had a little RTT at the store. And there's some questions about charging and fighting, so I figure we should go over them. Oh.
Yeah. There's a bunch of different stuff, but we're going to kind of go over the basics of it and then get a little more in depth. Everything in 40K right now is very particular about verbiage. There's a ton of stuff that we talk about, like, oh yeah, that's that thing, but it's like, no, if you're very particular about words, they mean different things. So, and that's where a lot of the confusion comes. Like saying, oh, I'm in engagement range. Well, sort of, it's only like the 1 inch, it's not the 2 inch sort of thing. So, anyway.
So I kind of put these together sequentially about how like charging sort of functions. So we're going to start with, so you're going to attempt a charge. You're going to do a charge. You have to be within 12 inches. And the first thing that will probably happen is someone will try to overwatch you. You can go ahead and take it away from there.
Sure. Well, let's start with you must be within 12 inches. That is particular. You cannot even declare a charge unless the enemy unit is within 12. That is important because there's several ways for people to get like, oh, I could get like +2 to the charge or whatever else. I don't care that you could charge 14, 15 inches. You cannot even attempt to declare it unless you're within 12. That is just hard rules. So when you go to declare a charge, let's say you go to charge, one of the things that has changed with the new mission packet is when your opponent overwatches. In the past, it was you declare a charge, then do they want to overwatch? Let's say no, now I roll the charge. Well, it's changed in the new mission packet. Now you have to successfully charge before they can declare overwatch. So this is both good and bad for both players. So it's good for the player who's wanting to overwatch because now they don't waste a command point and an overwatch on something that you weren't going to make the charge anyway. But the opposite is also true because now it's like, well, I know I want to overwatch that unit and get some damage. Well, if you flub your charge roll and that's the only charge you're doing this turn, well, I didn't use my overwatch in your movement phase because I thought this would be better. So that can kind of go both ways. There's not necessarily a problem there, but it is a change that we have to be aware of. So you declare your charge, you roll your charge. If you have enough inches from your charge roll to make it to engagement range, then before you move, you ask your opponent, are you going to overwatch? If yes, they go ahead and overwatch. Let's say they do. For the sake of explaining some rules, let's say it's a bunch of Hellblasters. So with that, they are going to, let's say, hazardous on the Overwatch. They shouldn't do that, but let's say they do. If you have hazardous for some reason, you roll your hazardous rolls after you move. This is called out very specifically as like a, I don't want to say an FAQ, it's not, but more of a, looking for a thing here, commentary, that hazardous rolls are resolved after the charge is made. So they do Overwatch, you roll your, hazardous or whatever, and then they move into you. Now you remove the models from hazardous. This is called out so that you can't make it to where, like, again, Hellblasters, maybe I declare Overwatch, I overcharge for the sole purpose of I want to lose some guys to make the charge harder. They don't let you do that. They say your opponent gets to make the charge, now remove models as appropriate. It doesn't matter, they've made their charge.
Also, even though the Overwatch stratagem says at the beginning or end of a move or beginning or end of a charge, it's virtually impossible to overwatch someone after they've moved into engagement with you, like succeeded the charge and moved into you, because you can't you can't declare Overwatch then. It's like not allowed.
Basically, yes. I tell most people when I'm teaching them, you cannot fire Overwatch if you're engaged. And the short answer is there's a bunch of things that, Overwatch is as if in the shooting phase, and like pistols, I can shoot even if I'm engaged, as when in my shooting phase, stuff like that. There's a whole bunch of stuff to where this can get really confusing. And this is where most of the questions have come over the last couple of weeks at like the RTT. But the short answer is there's a section in the rule book called out of phase rules. So it's basically doing things as if the shooting phase, but it's not actually the shooting phase. Well, it calls out in there that basically things that talk about as if the shooting phase don't really apply. So big guns never tire, pistol, etc. They don't really apply when doing Overwatch. So if you're engaged, there's virtually no way to actually shoot a gun. There are things that apply when you're overwatching. For example, if you have a unit with an ability that says when making a ranged attack, reroll ones, or oath, or something like that, there's a bunch of stuff to where it can still affect your shooting. It's not just straight shooting, but anything that calls out the shooting phase specifically will not apply, even though it says as if the shooting phase.
Yeah, it's kind of like as if is its own thing unto itself. The as if any phase is not equal to that actual phase.
Correct. And that's where most of the confusion comes. Because again, if you don't read the out of phase rules paragraph that's like hidden in the rule book or app somewhere, well then all you're reading is, pistol or big guns never tire, and you're like, no, it's a shooting phase, I get to do that. It's not actually how it works. Yeah. The minute you read that one extra paragraph, it kind of caveats a lot of stuff.
All right, going on. Okay, so moving into engagement. Did we touch this? No.
We haven't really touched this yet. There's a bunch of little things here, and as much as I'm going to explain these, I'm then going to go back and talk about how it's not actually true. But when you are charging and making a charge move, let's say I declare a charge against X number of units. I don't care if it's 1, 2, 3. In order to make your charge move, you must end successfully within engagement range of every unit you declare to charge. So if I declare 2 different units and I only rolled high enough to make 1, it doesn't matter that I could make engagement range. It is not successful unless I make engagement range of both units that I declared. Next, you have this separate caveat that says if a model can end its move in base-to-base contact with another enemy model, it must do so. And this, again, is caveated by end within base contact of only the units that you declare to charge against. If there's some other unit, you can pile into that later, which we'll touch on in a minute, and fight them, but you can only end within engagement range of the things you declared. And if you can make base-to-base contact, you must. However, giant caveat, you can move your models in the unit in any order. So there's a very real chance that you could, for example, move declare charge. Let's say I get an 8-inch charge. I only needed 6. Well, I could clearly put multiple models in base contact. But if I move the guys from the back first and they make engagement range, but they don't have enough to make base-to-base contact, if I keep doing that, I'm going to eventually get to the point, potentially, not always, potentially that the front model that could have made base-to-base contact now doesn't have a valid position to land in base-to-base contact, but he could still make engagement range or something like that. So now that model that could make base-to-base contact can't because of the order in which I move the models, and that is still okay. That being said, if you move the guys in the back and they, you daisy chained them or whatever, so now the guys in the back can't make engagement range, but you keep going from the back, and eventually you get to the model that could make base, and it can still make base in some way, it has to.
So if you want to minimize base contact, you have to sort of move block yourself, right?
Correct. Which is a valid tactic. There are reasons to do that. That's not always the best choice. There are times where you would rather be in base contact. Like if your opponent has the ability to interrupt in the fight phase or something like that, you may very well want to make base contact to keep, pin his vehicle in, or the transport or something, in order to keep it from moving. Or if you can pin this guy in place, maybe you'll be able to, in the pylon or pylon and consolidate also have this base-to-base mandatory thing as well. So you may want to, let's say, consolidate after you fought and pin a model in so that the only way for the unit to fall back is to desperate escape. There's a whole bunch of reasons where base-to-base contact is actually a good thing, but in the times where you want a little bit of extra movement in the pile-in, let's say, if you make base, you can't pile in because you have to end closer than you started, and you can't. So there are totally times where you want to move block yourself in order to prevent base, so that when I go to pile in, then I base, effectively getting an extra inch or 2 inches of movement that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
Right. Okay, going on. Being chosen to fight.
Okay, so there's a couple of tricks here. Fight first is a kind of the best thing in the game, right? Like, if you fight first, you win most fights. That's not always true, but when it comes to actually melee dedicated units, that's the key to everything. I know within the group we've talked a lot about like Master of Executions and Justicars and stuff like that. That fights first ability makes them feel like they're unchargeable because fights first is so powerful. Well, the short answer here is there's a couple of things, and we'll touch on some weird interactions, but charge bonus is a thing that you get when you make a charge successfully, and that charge bonus is effectively fights first. So even a unit that doesn't come with fights first, like Justicars, etc., you can gain fights first by charging. Most of us are aware of that, but all the fights first units go first, and then it's alternating activations as far as units fighting otherwise.
Well, it's alternating, starting with the player whose turn it isn't, right?
Correct, yes. And that's one of the things I'm going to touch on here on the next slide, but it's alternating activation. It starts with the non-active player, and then that's also true for the fights first. Effectively treat them as like kind of two different fight phases. You've got fights first fight phase, and then you've got regular fight phase. Well, in the fights first, let's say my opponent has a Justicar, and I charge that unit. Well, now we both have fights first, so in the alternating activation, it's going to go my opponent first in the fights first phase, air quotes phase, not actually a phase. And then I'll get to fight after they have fought, which is part of why those units feel a little unchargeable, because you want to have that ability to swing first. If they get to swing first, they could damage your unit enough to where you can't kill them, even though you charged. Anyway,
Right. Makes sense.
So, in addition to this fight first and then regular fight stuff, you've got pile-ins. Pile-ins you only get to do if there is an enemy unit to actually pile into. So when you go to pile in, if there's no enemy within 3 for some reason, but you're still able to be selected to fight, you can't pile in. But if you can pile in 3 inches and within engagement range / base contact, you must end closer than you started for the most part, then you get to pile in. So it's extra movement, which is very nice. It helps you get extra models swinging. It also just helps you move models across the table. But as far as who gets to fight, that is the big one that is a little confusing. And this is a thing we learned at Nova, because it was pointed out to us. We basically, everyone who can fight, we've been saying is in engagement range, which it turns out is not actually true. And there's only a few times where this actually comes up as mattering, so it's not a big deal, but it does exist in the game, so it's an important note to kind of learn early before it catches you out. Engagement range is being within 1 inch of an enemy model. Obviously, if you're base-to-base contact, you don't get to pile in or consolidate because you can't end closer, but engagement range is only that 1 inch. We are used to saying that if you're in base contact of a friendly model that's in base contact, you get to swing as well. And while that is true, that second rank of base to base doesn't actually count as in engagement range. They just count as being able to fight.
Right. Especially if a base is more than 1 inch, which I know they're in millimeters, so that's confusing, but 40s are more than 1 inch.
Yes. 32s are approximately 1 inch. That's kind of the thing to go off of. That being said, one of the big things that I've seen people do is they'll put a character in the unit that's got this like oval base, whether it's a Lord on Juggernaut, or there's several other examples, but you can have this oval base in a unit that isn't oval bases. And now when you go to engage them, you've got this oval base kind of sticking the thin end within engagement range on base contacting. And then you have all these other ones kind of touching the butt on the oval base trying to swing as well. They totally get to swing, but they don't actually count as an engagement range. While it doesn't involve an oval base, one of the good examples here is like the jump pack intercessors. I believe they get to roll a die for each model within engagement range. Well, I was playing incorrectly and saying the second rank that gets to fight also gets to roll a die because they're in engagement range, but they're not. It would only be the front rank, the actual models that themselves are within 1 inch. Knowing this, we can make adjustments, and totally it's not a penalty. It means we kind of like zigzag the models so that you can kind of fit the 32s between each other just enough to where they also get within 1 inch, and you can still make it work. But it makes it way more important to check your positioning when completing your charge moves or pile in things like that, because engagement range is not the same as what units get to fight.
Right.
Okay, and then precision. Precision is a thing that also applies to shooting weapons, but this is a thing that seems to come up quite a bit as far as confusion is concerned, so it's a good time to go over that now too. When you are swinging with a precision weapon, you are effectively swinging at the unit. Precision does not, air quotes, trigger until after you've wounded successfully. It's worded a little differently. There's no like triggering in, verbiage in this game, but basically what it means is when you're swinging with a precision weapon, you're still swinging at the unit. You use your to hit roll, you use your to wound roll against the bodyguard unit's toughness, if there's a bodyguard unit, and you like swing as if you're swinging at the unit. After you've wounded successfully, then you basically declare that this is going against a character that you can see. If you're fighting around a building and you can't see the character, technically you can't precision them. That's within the precision rules. But the short answer here is it doesn't actually proc until after you've wounded successfully. So the wound or the toughness is based on the unit, the bodyguard unit. And then when they go to make saves, now the saves are based upon the individual character that the wound is being allocated to.
Interesting. Okay.
So then we'll go to consolidate. So we've done all of our fighting stuff. Now we're going to go to consolidate. Well, consolidate says you get to move another 3 inches just like pile-in, but there's a caveat here. You only get to make that 3-inch move if you can end within engagement range of an enemy by moving closer. So let's say you kill the unit that you're touching. If there's no other unit around you to where you could pile into them, then you don't get to move with the consolidate. That being said, there's a trade-off there, because if you consolidate into that unit, now they get to swing at you. You've already fought. You can't hurt the unit that they're consolidating into, but they can swing at you. So there are times where you do not have to consolidate. You can just choose to, I'm going to stay put because I don't want you swinging at me. I would rather like force you to shoot me or move block you or not lose models, etc. The other caveat to consolidate, which is not in pile-in, is that let's say I cannot consolidate into another enemy unit. It's not possible. It's not that I'm not choosing to, it's that it's not possible. Now they say that I can consolidate instead towards the nearest objective marker, but as long as I end within controlling range, so 3 inches of that objective marker. If I cannot end within 3 inches of that objective marker, I also cannot move at all.
Right. Which is different than in the past. So,
correct.
Just to clarify, extra 1 million. So you've already piled in with a bunch of dudes. Which ones can fight? The ones that are touching base to base, and then the ones that are touching base to those?
So any model that is within 1 inch of the enemy unit gets to fight. That is engagement range. So I don't care if they're touching base or not, as long as the model's base is at least partially within 1 inch of the enemy, they get to fight. In addition to those that are in engagement range, models that are within base contact of a friendly model in that unit, not another unit, because you could have like charged 2 different units in there, but within the same unit, base to base with the same unit model that is that within base contact of the enemy, they get to kind of swing over the top of their friend and swing as well.
Okay, makes sense. Even if it's like way more than an inch away.
Correct. Because again, yes, if you have like that big honkin' bike base or whatever, you can have the bike base barely touch. The bike base is like, depending on which one you're using, is like 3 inches long almost. And then you could have someone whose base contact with the back end of that being effectively 3 inches away. They could still swing because of the base contact rule.
No, I get you. Okay. Moving on. Fight phase wild interactions. Okay, here we go.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about some of these. So charge bonus is a specific, we'll call it keyword or rule. Charge bonus refers to a unit gaining fights first when they charge, but it specifically calls out, after you read it like 3 times, that it's effectively the charge bonus is only gaining fights first. Heroic intervention is a stratagem that is underutilized and very good. That basically lets you countercharge your opponent after they charge one of your friendly guys. Another unit can charge into that to try to help. Well, it says in the stratagem you do not gain any charge bonuses. Well, there's really only one, and that's fights first. There's been a lot of confusion with, okay, but my unit says when I declare a charge, I get like Lance. I have, if I've charged this turn, I get +1 to wound. Or there's some other units that say, if I've charged this turn, my unit gains lethal hits, or something like that. You still gain all of the other benefits, we'll call them, from charging. You just specifically do not gain fights first from heroic intervention. You could still have fights first from a character or something like that, but you do not actually gain the charge bonus, but you can gain charge benefits, which is the confusing part.
Okay.
Then we talked about opponent fights first. Again, if your opponent has fights first because they have a master executions or something like that, you can get into some really weird like choices of like, I have this melee unit of Terminators or whatever the case is, and like I want to charge. That's their whole job. If I charge, if I can touch it, I kill it. Well, there's times where you don't want to charge because if your opponent has the fights first ability, when you charge, you also gain fights first, but your opponent swings first. And if they're also a good melee unit, they might kill enough of your guys before you even swing that it's not worth charging. So this also applies to non-fights first. If let's say I charge, I fight, and you use a stratagem that effectively stops me from killing the unit. Well, now we're sitting there staring at each other. When it goes to your turn, if you don't fall back when we get to the fight phase, I actually get to swing first again because it's the non-active player who gets to fight first, and we're at the same speed of not fights first.
Right. Makes sense.
So that can create some weird interactions. Most people understand it as far as when it comes to not fighting first, but it's that my unit has fights first where it can become kind of weird because you don't want to charge those units, even though like charging is almost always the right answer.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Okay.
Fighting units you didn't charge. I also touched on this a little bit. So let's say I charge a unit and I move block myself with the charge, so I don't really base contact things. And a part of this is, I move block myself from engaging this dreadnought. Well, these other models that couldn't make engagement range and are kind of wrapped around the side trying to get to them. When it comes to my pile in, because the dreadnought was trying to be protected by some other unit, maybe when I go to pile into the nearest enemy model, which is what Pile-In requires you to do, maybe it's not the Dreadnought. Maybe the unit next to him of Devastators or whatever the thing is, maybe I'm there closer, so then I pile into those, making engagement range of those guys. The exception here is always you have to maintain unit coherency. If that would prevent you from maintaining unit coherency, you can't go there. Anyway, so now that I've piled into this other unit that I never declared a charge against, which is totally allowed, now I go to, after pile-ins, declare my attacks. Well, that model is going to declare its attacks to the thing it's engaged with. There's no restriction, because there has been in previous editions, that says you can only fight the things that you charged. You can fight anything you're engaged with, all the time. So this allows you to fight things without directly charging them. A really good example of this is, let's say I'm playing a bunch of Infernus Flamer guys, and if you charge me, I'll just absolutely murder your unit because it's auto hits on Overwatch, etc. Well, I'm going to charge the again, Dreadnought next to them and intentionally move block myself as best I can without breaking the rules, because you still have to base one appropriate. And in doing so, it allows me to pile in and fight these Flamer guys without ever charging them. And this is a really good, like, high skill mechanic that is designed to be this way so that you can get around some crazy Overwatch stuff.
Okay, that makes sense. And when it comes to the order of who fights, after fights first, would the Infernus go first, or would your guys who piled in swing first?
Okay, so we're going to totally take a step back from that and go. This is a question we got a lot at Nova, or I heard other people asking a lot at Nova because I had to like defend my position once or twice. When a unit is selected to fight, the unit can only be selected to fight when it meets one of two categories. It is an appropriate time for it to be selected, and your unit is either engaged or you have successfully charged this turn. So like Jump Intercessors, if I charge a unit, I've successfully charged, I roll my mortal wounds on the charge, and I totally kill a unit. There's like 2 Grots left, and I killed them on the charge. Sounds great. Well, now that I've done that, they're still selectable to charge, and maybe I pile into the unit that was behind those Grots, and I start fighting some boys.
Right, assuming they're within pile-in range.
Yeah, assuming they're within pile-in range and all that good stuff. All of that is true, but one of the biggest things in here is that you alternate selecting a unit to fight. When a unit is selected to fight, it must complete its entire fight phase. That means once it is selected to fight, it will complete its pile-in, then it will complete its fighting, then it will complete its consolidating, then that unit is done for the fights phase, and your opponent now gets to choose a unit. So if the example I was going with the Flamer guys, if I charge in and I select them to fight because they have fights first, and they're like the only legal target, if I pile into another unit because I've selected them to fight, I would fight and consolidate before my opponent would be able to select a unit to fight. So there's no way to interrupt the fight process once a unit has been selected to fight. The stratagem that lets you fight after an enemy unit has fought is not before the consolidation, it's after they've completed their fighting as a whole, which is all 3 steps.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a couple of extra things there. So then the last thing I wanted to touch on was specifically when we talked about piling into units you didn't actually charge. This becomes very important when it comes to beginning of fights phase abilities. So there's several units, but the example here is Blade Guard. There's also like Tyranid Warriors, etc. They have an ability that says at the start of the fight phase for Blade Guard, select basically aggressive or defensive. If you select the aggressive, they get to reroll, I think it's hit rolls of 1 or wound rolls of 1. If they select defensive, they get to reroll saves of 1. Well, this is really important that if you have that in your army, you are thinking about that. And at the beginning of each fight phase, before anyone has fought, before anyone has been selected to fight, you declare what the Blade Guard are going to do, even if they're not engaged. Because what happens if I charge into the Dreadnought and then pile into Blade Guard? Well, now you didn't declare what you're doing at the beginning of the fight phase, and you have to like take a step back and be like, all right, wait, hold on. Now that they're engaged, I'm going to say reroll, saves of 1. Well, okay, well, that seems reasonable. Maybe, it's also reasonable to say that, like, before I piled into you, if you would have said reroll 1s to hit, maybe I wouldn't have charged into you. Or if you had said reroll 1s to save, maybe I wouldn't have piled into you. I would have, like, tried to go after something else. So it's not necessarily fair to your opponent to go backwards. Oh, I didn't realize you were going to get to me. I'm going to do the thing. It's also not fair to you for you to pile, like, your opponent to pile into the unit, and then you don't get that ability at all, because it's not like you can choose to not do your ability. It's basically at the beginning, you just select one. Technically, you're obligated to do it, even when there's nothing engaged anywhere. So obviously, for the sake of like speed, you don't need to like interrupt turn 1 with like, all right, fights phase, I'm going to declare this, even though nothing made a charge at all ever. Like, you can kind of skip past that, but you want to declare these abilities even if your unit's not engaged, if it's reasonable that they could possibly get to you, because you don't want to miss out on your ability, and you don't want to cheat your opponent out of making a different decision, because it gets really feel bads on both sides when, let's say I pile into Blade Guard, you say, oh, by the way, I'm going to reroll saves of 1, or I'm going to reroll wounds of 1. Oh, well, now that you're declaring that, I'm going to decide not to pile in and move my models back to maybe the position they were in before. I don't really know. Like, it's best for both players to just stay in front of that problem by declaring this at the beginning of the fight phase. And it's mostly on the player who has the ability, because they're the one that knows this specifically says beginning of fight phase. I need to declare this.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, there are more weird interactions with the fight phase, and Overwatch and stuff like that. We'll probably go over that in another video, because there's one specific thing that's a little wild, but it's going to show up so rarely that we didn't really want to touch it here. This is about understanding the concept of the fight phase and the most common things that are going to show up that you need to stay on top of.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everybody for listening. I hope this was educational.